Hello and welcome to Maiden, Mother, Matriarch with me, Louise. My guest today is Stephen Shaw, writer and director and producer of the documentary Birthgap, which was first released in 2021, which describes the fact that birth rates are falling almost everywhere in the world, that we are entering into the second demographic transition in all rich parts of the world, and many other parts of the world are quickly catching up, and why there are going to be various unwelcome social, economic and political consequences as a result of this. Stephen dug into the data on why actually mothers are having just as many children as they were in the 1970s. What's really rising is childlessness among both women and men, and the fact that most of this childlessness is unplanned and comes down normally to coordination failures in terms of finding the right partner at the right time. In the extended part of the episode, we also spoke about why mass immigration isn't an answer to this problem and why we might be entering a third demographic transition. That extended version of the episode can be found at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also, as always, find the whole extended catalogue of the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, as well as bonus episodes I do fortnightly with my husband and the MMM chat community. Enjoy. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we can't really understand ourselves or understand the world around us without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to put you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions, which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. Stephen, should we start by talking about some of the things that people tend to get wrong about why birth rates are collapsing and what we can do about it? Because it is, as it's become an increasingly prominent topic, it's one of those topics that sort of it invites a lot of speculation. And I'm guilty of this as well, because everyone seems to have a sort of favoured theory as to the one big factor that means that we are where we are. What do you think is, where do people tend to go wrong, just in terms of the data from your experience?
Yeah, this is actually something that I'm delighted to start with this because we all do exactly that. I would have done that before I started my own research back in 2016. You hear things like in Italy and Spain, it's to do with high youth unemployment. It's to do with inflated property prices today in the UK and elsewhere. In Japan, it's work-life balance, etc. And people, you're right, we do have a tendency to try and, reverse in our own theories of what may be wrong with the world and assume perhaps it's natural that birth rates are a factor of that. But actually, if we simply start with when did this trend start? We can say very clearly it goes back to around 1971, 1972, 73, when the world was going through a number of economic shocks. We can see in data, and that's where I come from, I simply look at data first and foremost. We can see absolutely this started in multiple countries in the early 1970s. And not only did it start there, it's never reversed itself. In any of these places, it's simply solidified and then grown further and further and further for what is over 50 years now. Now, if you were to speed that up, we've just lived through one of the world's worst viruses in recent times, and we've been very accustomed to how viruses spread, and we've become accustomed to how waves of viruses kind of quickly take over, and then how they might subside. Well, population is exactly the same. If you were to speed up birth rates from 1973 up until now, you would see the same wave growing and not stopping. So if you're going to apply your theory that this was caused by, name whatever it is, that happened to start, let's say, property prices in the past 10 years, let's say youth unemployment, let's say all the things that are going on in the manosphere right now are not going on in the manosphere, you've got to really go back to 1970 first and explain how that might have applied, or even changed or morphed since then. So what we find is that this is a global trend. It spread from a number of high developed countries, but it wasn't universal. It did not start in all countries at the same level at the same time. There were differences. And further, that all of the kind of triggers that we see are linked to some form of unrest. We can go into details on that, but we find things like the oil shock. We find things like the mortgage crisis in 07, 08. At the same time, in multiple places, pushed birth rates down and down and down. So that's number one. Number two, I feel, is actually the most important thing, if we can just continue to this second point. Motherhood throughout all of these decades has not changed at all. There's absolutely no trend in terms of the number of children that mothers are having falling. To be clear, if we go back to, let's take Japan, perhaps the most famous example, the average mother in Japan in 1973 was having 2.3 children. Today, it's exactly the same. In the UK, if I just checked some numbers going back to actually 1960 in the UK of data, the average mother, now not woman, I'm saying mother, the average mother in the UK in 1960 was having 2.5 children. Today, it's exactly the same. So throughout all of these times, the only single thing that has changed meaningfully at all is an absolute rocketing in childlessness. So, this pivots everything to the point that I actually feel sorry for demographers because they've built up all of their research and theories based on this average woman. Have you ever met an average woman, Louise? I mean, this average woman is just some idea that should help us understand trends. But if we have two different trends happening at the same time, or in the case of motherhood, a non-trend, averages like the total fertility rate simply get the way of any of us, demographers included, being able to understand what's happened to societies.
A lot of people will find this really counterintuitive because they'll think, hang on, what about all these, families with 10 children in the 19th century? And how many families do you see now with 10 children? What we're comparing though, right, is the number, the family size in the 1970s to now, because that's when you see this massive drop off.
That's right.
And that's when you haven't actually seen, maybe counterintuitively,
that's right,
a reduction in the number of children that mothers are having.
That's a key point. And actually in the US, it was from around the 1980s. The average mother, mid-80s, was having 2.4, 2.5 children. It's now 2.6. It's actually gone up in the US. So Japan, UK, Europe settled to this lower level of family size, 2, 3 being the most common number in the 70s or 80s. But you're all right. Prior to that, the entire world was quite different because there was often perceived some advantage or cultural norm to have as many children as, to have more children, whatever the reasons were. That really ended in, even in India now, frankly, if you want to talk about the less developed world, it's happening there too now. In India, the average mother, again, it's not a term I like, but the average mother is having around 2 children. So, yes, we go through the first transition, which is down to smaller families, 2 or 3, and that gets locked in once you have your first child. But the reality is, and there's a third surprise in my search, maybe it's a good moment to introduce it now, is my finding in the countries that went through this phase earliest, like Japan, like much of Europe, is that the vast majority of these women were women who had planned to become a parent. Something went wrong, you might say. And I will say also, let me say it now, I always try to make it clear that I'm passionate about those people who don't want children having the right not to have children. I think I don't want to live in a world where people who don't want to have children feel pressurized into doing so. That's wrong. But it turns out the vast majority of childless people, very, very unfortunately, and it is a tragedy. In the documentary I created, we film, one of the episodes with people, women and men, going through what they describe as grief over a loss of something they never had. So, the whole understanding of birth rates, what you read in the media, what we talk about is really quite different. It's to do with a rapid increase in what I call unplanned childlessness. People waiting to have a child and finding out life takes the life journey turns out differently to what they perhaps expected. So.
Yes. Do we know as much about men who end up childless? Is it, because my understanding is that we tend not to measure it as well in
Yeah,
the sort of
I
demographic
know.
data, which makes it yeah. But do we have any reason to think that the proportion of childless men is any lower or higher than the proportion of childless
It,
women?
well, it's actually higher. It's slightly higher, and the reason for that is men are more likely to marry a second time and to have a second family than women are. So you end up, the corollary of that is that there's a group of men who actually never marry at all because some men are taking up, two partners, if you like. That may not be a huge difference, but overall the numbers are higher. I mean, it's a great question, and again, as a man, I often wish I were able to talk just as openly as about men as I am women. The reason I can't is that we traditionally, record births based on the age of the mother, the date and time of birth, based on it's all around the mother, even the mother's education. For whatever reason, we don't or haven't asked those same questions of men. It may be changing in some places, but I guess you might say there's a lot more certainty over who the mother is than would be the case for men. Maybe that plays into it too. But I will answer your question in this way. Part of what my research involved was going to talk to people around the world who were childless, some having chosen to be childless, many, many not. And the men we encountered were experiencing, if anything, more grief than the women at not becoming fathers. I think there's something really deep within many men about being a father. And I think we also fall into this trap, foolish as we are, of thinking that, well, age doesn't matter for us. We can wait longer, forgetting that we actually have to attract a partner who is within the fertility window to want to have a child with us. And as we get older, we're competing with younger versions of ourselves for that same pool of women. So I think men have a lot to learn from this too.
Do you think men tend to hit that point later in their lives, though, because the biological window is longer, and men more likely to have that, oh my goodness, I'm actually not going to have children moment?
No, I don't think biology. I think the window for men is defined by the women, defined by the window for women. So, if you like, whoever in the couple hits the biological window first defines what that window is for the couple. The exception to that would be if a man is able, and some are, they tend to be very famous, very, very rich, or both. If they're able to attract women of whatever age they desire within reason, and that doesn't apply, but that really is a fairy tale for the vast majority of men. You are looking at situations where the men are a little bit older than women. It does vary by country. 2 years to 4 years appears typical. So when that is the societal norm, it really doesn't matter if a man can have a child till very late in life or not biologically. He is bound by the biological window of that relationship, of that couple, and that is by nature's decree the woman usually.
So they hit the moment of grief at the same time.
Well, that's right, and it may be slower for men to, if a man is already in a committed relationship. I know there can be turmoil there. I know there can be a lot of turmoil, and a lot of it's hidden. I think men, being what we are, we tend to hide feelings, but there are, and I should just mention, a number of support groups for men. And certainly for women who are out there to help people, perhaps listening to this, who are going through that. This is not a small thing for very many people.
Two things that are really striking about your documentary. One is the fact that this is happening almost everywhere. Which again is quite counterintuitive to people who are not maybe up to speed on some of the more recent demographic data. There's a really striking scene where you're interviews with young women in Nepal. Nepal is a poor country, right? Certainly relative to the West. And even so, you're hearing these young Nepalese women saying the sort of things that you would expect to hear, almost on Sex and the City. This sort of I want to be putting my work first. It's incredible actually to be hearing that kind of what sounds like a very westernized reasoning process around having children. coming from places which really have only just hit that. I mean, whatever the threshold is for when birth rates start to really fall, maybe $5,000 a year kind of average income, something around that range. As soon as people hit that, it seems as if this low fertility culture starts to kick in.
That was, that scene in the documentary, just to a little more color to it. I actually ended up hiking up well, to me, it was a very large mountain. It's certainly a mountain in the Himalayas, because I asked a local guide to find a large family for me, and he couldn't in the kind of lowlands, because just people aren't having large families anymore. But he did find one up this trek. He told me it would take 20 minutes. It took me at least double that. And we got to talk, and it was a family with 6 children, and interviewing the daughters, as you were referring to. The biggest shock for me was when I asked the eldest daughter, 19, she was married with a son. I asked how she met her husband. She used a dating app. This is a home without electricity, running water, and she used a dating app, and it's the trend now. They have phones. They hike down to the village to charge their phones, and what a change is happening. And that typified, the many countries I went to. Africa is not quite at the same level yet, but the average woman in sub-Saharan Africa, while having around, I think it's 4.5 children on average right now, that's reducing by 1 fewer child per family every 15 years. So we can see, in another generation's time, they are going to be approaching replacement level frankly, a frightening pace. This is transformational for any society. And whilst there are good things to do with that, a lot of this is linked to women's education, which I support. I support for my daughter. I support for everyone in society. But it does seem that, given the evidence, that once someone, whatever their level background, urban, non-urban, across all of these countries, once they have the first child, typically they're going on to have the second or third, and those numbers don't change over time. It does seem that careers and our education paths simply get in the way of fertility windows. And I do want to mention here, it's not just fertility. In fact, there's actually a bigger reason than the biology itself. It's not having a partner at that right time. We may have educated ourselves quite well in the biological clock. Actually, that's probably wishful thinking. I think we're still quite ignorant in the biological clock for women. But even if we still have to factor in meeting that partner who also wants to have a child at that right time. And that's where I think many people sadly end up, childless for life.
So in countries like, say, Nepal, sub-Saharan Africa, is it that same pattern where the women who are having kids are having roughly the same number as, say, their mothers did, but it's the proportion of women who are not having kids is growing? Is it the same pattern that we're seeing elsewhere?
Actually, just to be clear on this, it's actually very interesting, because demographers talk of the first demographic transition and then the second one. There are two. The first transition is when, and this is happening across much of sub-Saharan Africa right now, you can see it. It's a transition from when it becomes beneficial to have a large number of children. And to keep them at home, to give them relatively minimal education, because you need them. You do need them, because there's no running water in your village. You need that water. So someone, maybe a couple of kids, need to go several times a day to bring back water. Others need to go and help, till the land, go to market, etc. Having a family of 2 or 3 children will, almost certainly bring intense levels of poverty. The transition happens usually after you get running water. There's a certain level of basic facilities for families in the region, in the town, the village. And suddenly the attraction becomes, well, let's get our kids educated instead. Let's have fewer children. And let's take advantage of, maybe they'll become doctors. We heard that everywhere. We heard that in Africa. We heard that in Latin America. I heard in India. Of young people being driven to become doctors. There's this transformation, and it's a good thing, in terms of what education can do. So, I don't think anyone's arguing against the benefit of, prioritizing education. So that's the first transition. The second transition has left demographers mystified. It's the transition to this ultra low level that we're seeing in the UK, US now, just like we saw start in Japan, Italy, and so on. That transition has had lots of question marks over it. And because, frankly, no one was looking in the right place. No one was trying to measure the transition to childlessness the way I frankly, devoted several years of my life to doing, and find that actually that is the thing here. The second transition is when 20-30% or more of people wanting to have children end up childless, and the overall birth rate comes down to this average woman, but actually mothers are having the same. And so there's two transitions, and Africa, you can see the start of the second one, but the first one is really what's happening there now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Africa is still at the first transition stage, but many other countries are moving into the second, even not very rich countries necessarily.
I think that's a good generalization. I don't like generalizations, because even if you go to Nigeria, a huge country that's growing rapidly, you can go into it and you can find communities that are quite wealthy with low birth rates. You can find childlessness there. So I think the best way to frame it is when there's extreme poverty. Mm-hmm. That's an official term defined by the UN. When there's extreme poverty, you tend to desire a larger number of children. Once you go beyond extreme poverty, the advantage becomes fewer children. That's what Africa is going through now in those areas where we still have, sadly, high levels of poverty.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then you've got this more mysterious stage, which Europe and Northeast Asia are well into. Another thing that you really highlight in your documentary, which we've mentioned already and I want to get into more, is the fact that so much childlessness is involuntary. An enormous amount of childlessness is involuntary, actually. So much more, I think, than most people would tend to assume.
Yeah, and I came at this from a data perspective, but it turned up I kind of found various academics who had written qualitative and some quantitative studies on this, and we came up with the same numbers. Which is around 4 out of 5 people who are childless had planned to become a parent one day. And we've seen where you look at meaningful large-scale surveys. We've got CDC national database in the US, which tells us the same story. We've recently had a large survey in the UK. The UK one showed that 92.7% of British women between 18 and 35 either have children or plan to be a parent one day. It's only 7% do not. Now, when you therefore look at numbers, in the UK is heading for 30% or more childlessness. In Japan, it's reached 40%. You clearly something is going awry for 20, 25, 30% of young people who, during the fertile years, do have that urge to have a child. And when you look at what that is, this is where data really helps. It helps exclude, first of all, the idea we can throw money at this problem, the idea that we can bring out all of these incentives for people to have children. There's no evidence that works anywhere. Now, there's evidence that family-friendly policies in general, creating a mood where in a society it becomes the norm to thinking of a child at a younger age. Those may work. We're not certain, but what we see in Hungary is such a wide-ranging set of policies that promote parenthood. I've been there several times recently, and there's little brass plaques at the airport saying "family-friendly Hungary," and you can feel it when you're there. Not in an oppressive way at all, actually. So in terms of what we can do, to persuade people to, I think I've gone off topic slightly down into financial incentives, etc. But so I'll leave it to you to get us back on track here.
No, go on. This is
I spend a lot of time, frankly now, talking to people, even advising, various entities, including governments recently, in terms of what they should do. And the idea that you can simply throw kindergarten spaces at this, those might be great things to have, or that we need better work-life balance. So yeah, men should be doing more. I can't defend that for a second. All these things may be really positive things for a society, but the idea that we're going to suddenly cure this by policy will not happen. I think one of the things I heard you discussing actually was, if I can call out, you were with on a podcast with Chris Williamson. The idea of people, doing what their peer groups are doing. I think you made the comment that if your sister or family member has a child, you're more likely to have a child, and absolutely, I can see that. I can see it in reverse, because what happened Why is it that the oil shocks and the mortgage crises, etc., caused this huge increase in this? I call it unplanned childlessness. I think involuntary. I don't know. It sounds like a medical term for me. I prefer to call it unplanned childlessness, because people assume it'll happen at some point, and for most, thankfully, it does. But for this increasing majority, it still doesn't. But still, why is it that these crises increase unplanned childlessness, but it never reverses? At the end of the crisis, it's not like things settle back down to normal again. What's happened is there's been a societal change in the normative period as to when peer groups tend to have children. And once that gets pushed into the 30s, and it has now, it becomes unusual for many to think of having a child, certainly early 20s, certainly teens, and even more and more late 20s. So I think what has happened, I call it the Birthgap trap, where we kind of get trapped into this normative societal behavior that over 30 is the time to start families, when biology and mating compatibilities, or simply being able to find a partner post 30, if anything, get significantly harder. So therefore, to come back to the idea, let's throw money at this. Well, yeah, sure, let's give someone, a large check to have a child. But if they don't have a partner, or they've just gone through a divorce, or if their promotion that they're counting on to propel their career further and further is only a couple of years away, yeah, a check, almost no matter how many zeros, is not going to persuade everybody. Maybe not many people at all. So, sorry, I kind of get on my, little perch about, what incentives can do here. And almost nothing is the answer.
It's mostly a bad news story. I've gone on the same journey. When I initially became interested in this a few years ago, I had sort of hoped that, we just tweak a policy here and there and it will sort of all come right, because we have all these surveys, as you've described, showing that the vast majority of people would like to have children. Lots of mothers as well would say that they'd like to have more children than they have, So theoretically, you'd think it would be easy enough to just offer whatever it is, tax breaks, nursery places, whatever, and everyone would do what they wish to do. And yet that doesn't seem to be how it works at all. My anecdotal impression as well, not just based on the data, although I believe this shows the same thing, is that just so much of it is about finding the right person at the right time. And that seems to be the enormous coordination problem that we can't seem to solve.
Yes. So we've come to the same conclusion, really. And, and therefore it is solvable. And the evidence I've seen, but not through policy, or not through direct policy. The way it's solvable, frankly, Louise, I feel a responsibility, and perhaps you do too, because awareness is the answer here. I'm finding that the more and more younger people that are made aware. So one of the statistics, if you look at all of these countries, is that no more, at most, half of women turning 30 without a child ever become mothers. 50. So the moment where you've got a toin cost,
that's a really devastating figure. Yeah.
Yeah, asking people, I did a small non-scientific survey just to get a sense of what younger women would think this might be, a couple of hundred people, and I think half of people said 40, 35% said 35, and I think it was 15% said 30. People have no idea really that. And biology, I recently was at an event in the UK, and I heard indirectly that a doctor was challenging this statistic that women have more than a 50% chance of conceiving at 30. That's not the point. If you look at outcomes, it's 50. It's actually at less than 50, and it's down to not having a partner. In many, not all, but many cases. And the hope I have is the reaction I've seen. I've seen it in the US, I've seen it in Japan with students, I've seen it in the UK too, very strongly, where young women are saying, wait a minute, you didn't tell me this. You told me to study, and I did that. You told me to get a career, to train for a career, whatever it is, to get on that path. And now I'm 28 or 32, and what do you mean you're telling me I had only, that 50% moment, is age 30. And I can see already where women are being active about creating a family younger, or finding that partner, that sturdy partner who will, sturdy is not the right word, but excuse my kind of, the right partner. Let's say it that the right partner to be there to be.
I think sturdy is a good word.
Okay, well, if you say so, then I'm happy with it. Let me see. What I mean is someone that you would want to be a father to your child. So I have a little story. I've only told it maybe once before in the podcast. So if I can, it's my hamster story. So this is a story about a young 27-year-old Japanese woman who, she everything going for her, I would say, looks wise, in terms of education, career wise. And she'd been dating a young man, similar age, for 3-4 years in a very loving relationship. And I asked, several things about this relationship. And it said, well, loving in the terms of she didn't feel that she could find anyone who loved her more than this person. And during COVID, they were together all the time, became very attached. After COVID, he went on a business trip for 1 month, and she was devastated, being alone, absolutely devastated, to the point he told her, look, I'm worried about you. Why don't you go and get that hamster that you always said you wanted? So she went and bought said hamster, this young little thing, I understand. And from that moment, all she could think about was the baby hamster. She was going to work, rushing home to make sure it was okay, to make sure it was fed, etc. She forgot about the boyfriend. If he had taken an extra month on a business trip, she wouldn't have cared. And when he did come back, she felt very possessive that this was her hamster, not his. And at that moment, we sat down. It's a friend of a friend. We had a coffee, and I asked her, do you want him to be the father of your child? And she said, no. And it took a hamster for her to realize she was with someone who was compatible in certain ways, who she'd become attached to. I'm not a psychologist, but I imagine there's things there to do with attachment theory, that actually, when she was presented with the reality that who would become a father for her, it was not this person. And then they went through a breakup, and it turned out that he wasn't very surprised, I think, that they broke up. And then she was confused by that. And anyways, is single as far as I know, and trying to find someone now who would make a good father. So when I said sturdy, I meant someone who you'd want to not only spend a life with, but be that father to your children.
Yeah, and this is where, so I want to raise the pill as a factor here, which we haven't mentioned yet. And the pill is a really, it might seem obvious that the pill is the cause of all of this. We know that it's not as simple as that, because actually people before the pill were actually quite good at controlling their fertility. And you saw falling fertility, say in France, a long time before the pill was invented. So it's not a simple story. My suspicion, though, is that even if the pill is not directly leading to women having fewer children within marriage, what it does do is it completely changes social norms in relation to premarital sex. So it makes premarital sex normal and part of the sort of typical life cycle. But that means that there isn't the sort of urgency, right? In a society where you're not allowed to have sex before marriage, there's a sense of urgency around finding the right marriage partner, which just doesn't exist, I think, in societies where you can have as much sex before marriage as you like. And indeed, you can have sexual relationships as a woman with men who are not even cut out to be hamster dads, right? Like men who are not actually father material. That's my suspicion as to what's going on with this coordination crisis in terms of people finding the right marriage partner. It's because the pill has completely changed the game. And now people are not, well, this is sort of the uncomfortable truth. People no longer feel forced to find a spouse early. And maybe it was really bad sometimes in the past that people felt forced to find a spouse early, and now they don't. I don't want to underplay the social and emotional costs of that, but also the truth is that with that pressure having been removed, what we see all over the world is people just sort of drifting into unplanned childlessness, as you described, because they just never. Yeah.
I think that's fair, and I'll come back to talk about the pill in relation to Japan in 1 second, because it's very interesting there. But yeah, I would add to the delayed marriage or delayed partnering, whatever it is these days, that there's this element of, there's this perceived idea that there's choice out there that tomorrow you might find someone even better. Therefore, there really is no rush because, why would you rush? If you did, you might find someone even better when it's, when it's too late. So I think all the forces have been actually going towards encouraging people to delay, to make sure they find that right partner. What you find is that whilst that does happen, you have to say for many, for a significant minority, perhaps 30-35% now, it's still happening. You're getting to the end of that realistic fertility window without anyone. But to come back to Japan, Japan is fascinating in this regard because the pill was legalized after Viagra in 1990. So the pill was, I'm not sure, certainly the 70s, maybe even the 60s, it was legalized in most industrialized countries, but not in Japan. There may be, the best reason I've heard for this is that there were a number of very wealthy doctors performing abortions who had influence with politicians, and they were able to discourage this for a number of reasons. What I didn't know, however, until 6 months ago, after finishing the documentary, is that the preponderance of the pill in Japanese society today is 3%. 3. It is not a common birth control method at all. The condom is by far the most common form of contraceptive used. And I believe abortions are still relatively quite high. In fact, I know they are. So I know, and it's a tangent because it's not my expertise, but anyone wanting to research the hormonal aspects of the pill, which I'm certainly being alerted to, and certainly would say it's appears to be a concern. Looking at Japan, where that really has never taken off, might be an interesting kind of test case. But what happened in Japan, back to the sexual revolution, did it happen there? Yes, of course it did. And as I mentioned, abortions were almost a form of contraception there, and still may be. And of course, there are other forms of contraception. So it went through the same revolution. But I think it's therefore, in a general sense, oversimplistic just to blame it on the pill itself. It's not, and ever to your point, if you took the pill away, I think it's the point you're suggesting. I don't think we're going to go back to this era where suddenly people aren't having, extramarital sex like may have been the case some decades ago. So again, it's an oversimplification to me to simply say it's the fault of contraception. I think it's a more broad, the impact of what the pill may have brought, and maybe Japan copied the culture of Hollywood and other things without the pill actually being part of their culture. Maybe it actually, indirectly was still the reason that occurred. That's not something I'd want to ever, claim expertise on, but I do absolutely see, strange things now happening in Japan. Just to kind of put on the table, it is absolutely the case that there are many sexless people in Japan, and certainly including men. Maybe the majority are men. I know some are friends. It's quite a remarkable phenomenon that now seems to have taken in that we may have assumed was a Japanese phenomenon. But clearly, from what I'm seeing and reading online, is becoming much, much more common, particularly with young men in many other places. So there's something not right in terms of this, if I can call it, the sexual balance for men and women, and it very possibly hasn't been right for many, many decades.
Yeah, it is a very strange and mysterious thing, isn't it? The sexlessness phenomenon, which is, is particularly amongst in Japan and is increasingly apparent among younger generations elsewhere as well. And it's such a counterintuitive phenomenon to have come out of the sexual revolution, because on the one hand we have, my suspicion is that maybe it is actually linked, that when you have this sort of abundance of sexual stimuli in the form of porn, for women at least, if not for men, in terms of access to casual sex, then the impetus to seek out sex within a long-term relationship falls. Or I don't know, maybe it's something weird and hormonal. That's the other possibility, that it's the estrogens in the water or whatever it is.
Where I have come across it, I can think of three, immediate examples, are of young men who actually were in a relationship who gave up on sex after around a year. So this is, people in a loving relationship, living together, where it's been the man saying he's not really interested anymore. I know in one of those cases, yeah, I know in one of those cases, he was having, sex outside the relationship, um, which is unusual and may have just been something to do with the relationship itself. But he described it as now he considers his relationship more important than one based on sex. Very unusual to me, at least. The other two I are just cases where I know very frustrated women who are in a loving relationship where they want to be with a person where the man has just said no, it really isn't interested anymore. So it's something that I don't understand, but is clearly real. And I think without understanding this. Maybe there's some who do, but without understanding this, I suggest we're not going to be able to understand the reality of what's happening. Go back to the sexual revolution, back to falling birth rates, everything else. It's a key element of this.
I mean, the thing that my mind jumps to in hearing about those stories is something biomedical, something hormonal, whatever. Because that seems very odd that young men would just lose their sex drive.
I mean, yes. I mean, I almost didn't believe it before. I mean, I just, you may know, I now live in Japan, and I've been there 7-8 years. So I've developed many, I'd say, trusted relationships through making the documentary, and I've become kind of an agony uncle for a lot of young couples, and these things come out. But yeah, it's real.
I mean, the low fertility is just such an odd phenomenon because it seems to be so clearly non-adaptive, right? Like you would think it would be this fundamental drive. I mean, you might say, this obviously doesn't apply to some of these Japanese examples, but you might say, well, people have a drive to have sex, they just don't necessarily have a drive to reproduce. And what modern reliable contraception has uncovered is the fact that when you can separate the two, a lot of people will just forget about the reproduction. But that clearly doesn't tell the whole story. There's also clearly a sort of, it feels like almost a spiritual malaise. Are you familiar with Mouse Utopia? This
maybe
experiment.
Is this the Professor Calhoun's experiment? Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So. Yes, I mean, my understanding of this is that it wasn't necessarily a sort of rigorously conducted experiment, and there may have been other factors and so on. But the idea basically is that he put these mice into Mouse Utopia, so they had limitless amounts of food and sort of entertainment, whatever, and they reproduced. They became very overcrowded, and then it reached the point where the overcrowding was such that the mice just sort of lost the will to reproduce or even to go on living, and just sort of entered into a depression. And some people suggest that this is basically what's happening to humans, that the world is so crowded that we're sort of spontaneously deciding to stop reproducing. I don't find it very plausible, although it is very interesting.
So my thoughts on that, it's a fascinating experiment. That is, I think it's sweepingly applied to humanity. I mean, we're not mice first and foremost, and I don't know if that's been replicated anywhere, but I think one key point is that these mice were given all the water, all of the food that they wanted. They were kept in a warm area. There was nothing to fight for. There's nothing, every day was the same, and there were no threats to them. And the point where you're right, the population did grow, but it peaked sooner than the academic team thought. And then they went into this malaise where the prime young males with the best coats basically hung out together, and I don't know, just lay around. And they ended up with no interest in the female mice whatsoever, and birth rates crashed because there were no babies. So I don't think we can ignore the parallels with what's happening now. But, I do wonder, though, in all of this, if you take men's traditional role, which involved some level of putting oneself at risk for society and for the relationship. And that may be through, hard work. It may be through physical protection. It may be through going to wars in the past. Once those opportunities are taken off the table, wars maybe are sadly something that comes around again. But generally, women no longer have a need for a man in the way they did in the past. The question I have, and it's only a question, are men basically checking out because they don't know their role anymore? And that has a direct link to procreation in some way, that, well, if the world doesn't need me anymore, why am I investing in a relationship investing in 20 years of child raising? So I do worry that the role of being a man today, and I'm lucky being a bit older than my son's generation today, in their 20s. It's not easier for younger people today to kind of find, for young men to find that role for themselves. Would be my own feeling.
Have you seen Barbie?
No, I refuse to. I hear I should, though. There's a lot of commentators I must, but tell me about it. Did you like it?
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.